you know, where is Job? You know, I told him he's in yellow submarine. He's locked down. He locked down the submarine, cannot escape.
Well, listen, I've got to say, gentlemen, in 1 minute, the builders on my roof might start drilling holes again. So it's been an ongoing thing.
It's quite assemblage, yeah. I love the situation. You know, unpredictable assemblage came
so
out.
It might go a little bit pear-shaped later on. I might have to turn the mic off a bit because it's quite noisy. Yeah. Well, we should probably get started, shouldn't we?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, why not? It's a start.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me say something to introduce Ian then. Right. Thank you very much for everybody for coming today, and especially for Ian to take some time out from his very busy schedule. This is our second talk for the Global Center for Technology in Humanities at Kyunghee University in South Korea. And the first talk we had with Slavoj Zizek, and he was kind enough to have a chat with us as well. And that was only the other day. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Ian Buchanan of Wollongong University in Australia. He's going to discuss his new book, Assemblage Theory. For those who might not be familiar with Ian's work, there aren't many, I don't think, but he is one of the leading figures in the field of Deleuze and Guattari studies, especially in the English-speaking world. And he's been pivotal in making Deleuze and Guattari known to the wider academic community across the world. And through the journal Deleuze and Guattari Studies, not only philosophers, but all manner of thinkers from different disciplines have had the opportunity to collaborate and to research on these two very fascinating thinkers. Ian's the author of Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus and Deleuzeism, and a book on Frederick Jameson and life theory, and also Michel de Saussure, a cultural theorist. And he's the editor, if I'm not mistaken, of over 10 books, I think, mainly on Deleuze and Jameson. Ian is equally at home talking about social transformation and cultural theory and literary theory and philosophy and sociology and a whole range of topics. Ian's traveled extensively to promote his work, visiting dozens of universities across the planet, recently South Africa and North and South America, in Asia and in Europe, as well as down under. He's made Deleuze into something of a kind of global philosophy, if you like, or a philosopher of the planetary. His research is focused on raising critical questions about the prospects of schizoanalysis, which is the study of desire. This project is in some ways, you could say, is in crisis. And I think Ian's been responding to that in a very important way. You could say it's a crisis of desire, and you have to ask the question, why is it in crisis? And I think his book, Assemblage Theory, is in some way a kind of an excellent response to that kind of question. So we're going to have, the order for today, we're going to have an array of questions about Ian's book. And I think I should kind of kick off. Before asking Manoji and Tai Kwang and listeners to pose questions. So I've got just a question for you to get started, Ian. Could you explain what is an assemblage, and why is your theory of assemblage different from other writers? And how does desire work in an assemblage? If you could explain that, that'd be great.
I think I wrote a book to explain this, didn't I?
As a way to kind of introduce it, right?
But, yeah, we would have those audience who gonna read your book, so kind of guidance, you know,
a little bit glib. Thank you for that kind introduction and for that ridiculously big question to lead me off. I certainly wouldn't claim that it's my theory of the assemblage. I hope that I have, in what I've tried to do with the book, is to elucidate Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the assemblage. And I guess it differs from other versions of the assemblage, such as Delanda or Jane Bennett or Latour and many other people who've been interested in it, in that I have tried as far as possible to stick as closely as I can to what Deleuze and Guattari actually say. And so I guess, for example, Latour's version of the assemblage is very much his own version of it. And he takes one aspect of the idea of the assemblage as Deleuze and Guattari talk about it, and then takes off on his own direction and produces his own version of it, as does Delanda to a certain extent. He quite consciously says that his version is a kind of 2.0 of Deleuze and Guattari. So I guess my goal was to try to do something that was as close to Deleuze and Guattari's view as I could possibly make it. But their version is not clear, right? Like, I mean, partly they are very open about saying it's incomplete, like that they never finished the project of laying out their idea of what an assemblage could be and how it could work. So what we have is a set of preliminary sketches that we have to work with and then try to develop and see what we can do with those ideas. In order to answer the question, what is an assemblage, I think that it's the trickiest question of all to answer, because we tend to answer it by pointing to things. So we say, well, the university is an assemblage, or the internet is an assemblage, or whatever. But really, that doesn't really do anything more than just describe the thing in a new way. It's not really a form of an analysis, and I don't think it asks the right question. So the formation of the idea of the assemblage for Deleuze and Guattari goes back to the idea of the refrain, or the ritornello, as they called it originally. And what they were interested in is how does something like a piece of music hold together? And when you think about it, it's an extraordinary question. Like, if you whistle a tune, something about that tune has necessity, right? Like the notes seem to demand that they come together in this particular kind of a way. And when we talk about a piece of music being jarring, we sort of think, well, no, it sort of broke the rules of harmony. We didn't expect that note to be in that place. We wanted a different note to be in that place. And when you start to think about that, then in a sense, that's what you're talking about is the assemblage. That there is a set of rules that are intrinsic or immanent to an organization of things, and that those rules can be described. Rules are arbitrary, like there is nothing within the piece of music that says that it has to be composed this way. But nevertheless, once we start to listen to that piece of music, we kind of get the understanding that it does have to be this way. And so the rules are immanent. And I think that's what's really crucial, and that's what's really fascinating about the idea of the assemblage. And then once we carry that over into other aspects of daily life and start to think, well, why do we have these ways of doing things, and how do we know how to do these things, is, I think, quite a fascinating set of questions. Now, obviously, Deleuze and Guattari are not the only people who have ever asked these questions, right? Like, one could look at ethnomethodology of Harold Garfinkel. Huge amounts of sociology has been interested in the same kinds of questions. But they're trying to theorize it slightly differently, in the sense that they want to talk about rules that are perhaps unknown and unknowable to the people who live by those rules, or feel that their lives are organized by those rules. So I think that's interesting. But they take it a step further in the sense that the rules are not simply something that we adhere to. The rules bind us and create the social organization and the social and cultural entities that we want to kind of think about. And, to me, one of the great missed opportunities in Deleuze and Guattari's work is the cinema books. Somewhere Deleuze and Guattari talk in an interview somewhere, I don't remember the exact reference, but in an interview somewhere, they mention that the next book following A Thousand Plateaus was going to be a book that they were both going to work on cinema. And that never happened. Deleuze went off and then he wrote his own books on cinema. And he said somewhere in an interview again that he felt he had to kind of go on and do that on his own and kind of recover a little bit of himself. So, you know, there was obviously something that happened between the two of them. They felt they needed to take some time apart and he had to write this next book himself. But if you think about the kind of the inside of the first book of cinema, the thing that he's saying, which is quite extraordinary, is that when we started to watch movies, very quickly we understood the set of rules around the aesthetic that held the narrative together, that held time together, so that the film could move beyond a real-time scenario, that we didn't have to just have the train rolling into the station in real time, that we could introduce cuts. And that once we introduced those cuts, we could then magnify time infinitely. We could have movies that span thousands of years in terms of our response to it. So if you think about what holds that together, what makes it possible for us to watch a movie and jump those, you know, spans of time and deal with all the aesthetic kind of information that's going on in the film, that's an assemblage. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is conceptually organizing, that enables us to function in the world in the way that we do. And I think there's been, you know, many attempts to try to think about this in using different language. And the other example I would point to is Bakhtin's idea of the chronotope. We know that Guattari was a big reader of Bakhtin. He quotes his work all the time. And I suspect that the notion of the chronotope in Bakhtin's work is very much at the forefront of their thinking when it came around to doing the idea of the assemblage, that this was something that brought together time and space in a particular organizing kind of way that was the presupposition of a cultural organization or cultural practice. You know, long answer, but it's a super complicated question.
Yeah. Nice.
Manoj or Taekwang, do you want to jump in and continue that?
Yeah, actually, yeah, very interesting. The discussion about the assemblage, and of course, yes, if you're interested in more, you would actually read, you know, this book. The Ian quite clearly, you know, put down actually his conceptualization of assemblage against other, you know, this so-called other people's actual understanding of assemblage. And then I'm to some point, I'm quite actually agreeing, you know, when you said actually this concept is quite, you know, misunderstood by many the network theory, you know, something like that. So because it's nothing to do with, in my opinion, it's quite nothing to do with the kind of, you know, the network, something like that. Because in my opinion, it's this the concept as such, assemblage, is something counter, you know, concept, you know, to phenomenology. What I mean, the Merleau-Ponty, you know, for instance, you know, he tried to provide us kind of, you know, the preliminary or primordial, you know, stance of our perception. And then he finally actually ended up with the concept of flash, you know. But actually, you know, the actually Deleuze criticized that, you know, concept. Flash is already, you know, the principal kind of individual entity, and then there might be a more actually, you know, something, you know, the before the kind of flash came in or something like that. So that's why just he tried to bring in actually it's not like a primordial actually the stance of the kind of perception, but like ontological, you know, how can actually I could actually the put down, you know, this sort of the stance is very actually, as you said, is a kind of pre actually the liminal or something like that. Is a kind of, you know, something already, you know, pre-existing, which actually brought up the ontological stance is, as you said, the time and space, you know, something the kind of but the psychoanalysis called this, you know, the stance is kind of unconscious, but as you know, the unconscious is very limited, you know, concept by which we explain why this thing is happening. And you actually put down very clearly here why actually the Deleuze and Guattari question is why this thing happened, and then how this thing is that happen to exist, something like that. So that is actually a big question, but assemblage would be a very good, the concept to explain that. So, but thing is that you put this title is assemblage theory and method. So anyway, it's very actually typical to the delineate, the outline of this concept. But anyway, just you said this assemblage theory. That means we actually should have something to apply for, explaining, anything. That means if we said this is theory, that means something, of, something. That means kind of, the theory of something, what I mean. So there might cause another misunderstanding if you actually we said, this theory. So could you actually propose kind of Deleuze and Guattari sense of theory, They call the theories kind of toolbox. And then they said actually theory needs kind of function, by itself, in itself. So could you actually clarify, elaborate this concept more? Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it's kind of a tricky question to sort of think about what does theory mean. Certainly, Deleuze and Guattari are very hesitant to use the word theory. They tend to want to say that it's philosophy as opposed to theory. And probably they would be horrified by the idea of theory as we talk about it today within a contemporary setting. I don't have the same problem with the idea of theory that the more purist philosophers do. And I tend to agree with Jameson, who said we ended up with theory because philosophy kind of failed to realize itself, which is Adorno's great idea. But in a sense, theory comes after philosophy because philosophy could not explain or deal with or conceptualize the world that followed Second World War. There was nothing left for philosophy to say because all the kind of absolutes and truisms that philosophy had wanted to think about before then just proved themselves to be completely unfounded. I mean, as Adorno said, there was nothing about Germany's fantastic arts and sciences and philosophies that prevented the Holocaust. So in other words, philosophy becomes superseded at that point, and therefore we need theory. And so theory comes into being as something that does not have foundation, it is not grounded in anything in particular, certainly not grounded in an idea of the human or any ideals to do with the human. And so in a sense, we're having to rebuild those kinds of categories for ourselves. So I think if we were to look at it that way, Deleuze and Guattari might possibly be okay with the idea of theory. And certainly in the book, What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari talk about concepts as being interventions into the world. And I think that's really important. And I think that's what's interesting. And for me, that's probably the thing that makes me want to keep reading their work the most insistently, because I do think that we underestimate the degree to which concepts matter and influence and affect and shape the world. And, we live in a universe, maybe not so much in Korea, but I suspect even in Korea and Japan and India, where the sciences and the business schools pretty much dominate the university, and the humanities are deemed to be a kind of surplus value, if at best, like if we could get rid of them, they probably would. But we kind of forget that it's concepts. This is what I always try to tell my students, like it's concepts that drive this. So for example, the idea of value and the idea of monetary value is conceptual, and it's a concept that has intervened into the world, whereby we think that the only way to conceptualize value is through money. And we think that the only value of something is the price that we pay for it. And so then we have these kind of ludicrous anomalies whereby a tree is more valuable when it's cut down than when it's still standing. And in a sense, that's where the interventions have to come, and that's where they are coming. Sort of the humanities are saying, well, no, that's ludicrous. We have a completely screwed up idea of value if we think that a tree that's been chopped down is more valuable than a tree that is standing, or that we think, like bluefin tuna, which population has declined by 99-point-something% since 1950, and the only thing that's happened is that the price of bluefin tuna has gone up. such that now in Tokyo fish markets, you pay $1 million for a single fish. Instead of it being banned and just absolutely impossible to even buy it, like, you know, imagine trying to eat pandas or something, we just raise the price of it. So I think the intervention that philosophy can make is an intervention into the real world, but we intervene at the level of concepts and we intervene at the level of values. And I think that's the important work that we need to be doing. And we are doing. I'm not saying that we're not, because we certainly are. There's many really fabulous books being written by people trying to make exactly these kinds of interventions. But I think it's necessary for us to tell our students that that's what the humanities does, and that's why they should be studying the humanities, because it's much more important than the rest of the kind of universe gives it credit. Now, whether or not Deleuze and Guattari have a theory of everything, I certainly don't think so. I'm pretty sure that they would be reluctant to say they had a theory of everything. But I also think that there was a kind of impulse towards that. Like if you look back at 1,000 Plateaus, it's like they wanted to theorize everything, you know, like they just, you know, in some sort of mad but nonetheless brilliant way, they just tried to theorize everything across the space of the 7 years that they gave the lectures, and the students brought books and they talked about everything. There's music, there's war, there's geology, you know, you name it, and it's all there. So there was an attempt to kind of theorize everything. And I think that's kind of brilliant. But we have to remember that what they were doing was not trying to reduce everything down to one thing. They didn't just say there's just the assemblages and that's it. You know, there's not just one assemblage, there's not just one type of assemblage. So the theorization of everything is also a kind of project whereby they had to invent, you know, literally hundreds of concepts to be kind of complex enough to describe the world around. I'm not sure if that answers the question, Alex.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me pick up on the idea of intervention, because I was trying to make a comparison between your excellent book of Assemblage Theory and Delander's work. And it occurred to me that, because you've just been talking about 1,000 Plateaus and what they tried to do with the, you know, many kind of different disciplines and how they tried to write that book, it seems to me that you're trying to, it seems to me that your book is trying to distinguish Delander's understanding of the assemblage and your theory of desire. So when I was thinking about this, I came back to the distinction between Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. And my understanding of Delander came through Nick Land and the lecturer at Warwick University in the 1990s, and the very famous Virtual Futures conference, which Delander attended. So it seems to me like Delander kind of demarks Anti-Oedipus from 1,000 Plateaus. And I guess kind of there's a shift away from the aspect of desire in Anti-Oedipus. And, you know, we make this distinction between like the compromises of what we find in 1,000 Plateaus, like understanding the kind of composition or the construction of an assemblage as a way to ensure that the kind of assemblage doesn't go on a kind of suicidal kind of tendency. So can we say that Anti-Oedipus is a book of desire, and then 1,000 Plateaus is a kind of book of, according to Delander, a kind of book of abstract and impersonal assemblages? It seems to me that I got this idea from like when I read Nick Land in the 1990s, and Nick Land was very approving of Delander's War in the Age of Intelligent Machines and 1,000 Years of Non-Linear History. But then there's a kind of rejection of the kind of intentional acts of consciousness, and the idea that the subject desires, or the ego, the focus on the ego. And then there's a move to those kind of abstract and impersonal and diagrammed assemblages. And that would connect with the machinic phylum, the technological lineage. And that would, there's an idea about giving a new understanding of intelligence, like an impersonal and abstract intelligence. But then human desire is kind of secondary to that idea of the assemblage. So anyway, so what's really kind of quite bizarre is when you look at Delander's book on assemblage theory. In that book, there is not one mention of the word desire. I checked, not one word. of the desire at all, which is, you know, it's kind of astounding, really, that there would be a book without the word desire. So it seems to me that Deleuze is not at all interested in constructing the idea of constructing assemblage, constructivism, which I think you brilliantly kind of work on it in your book. So can you have an assemblage theory without the concept of desire? That's my question to you.
It seems the construction is start.
Yeah, look, I think, you know, one could say that Deleuze does have an assemblage theory without desire, but it's not the same thing as Deleuze and Guattari's assemblage theory. And some people find it very productive. I guess famously don't. And I think that it's just ludicrous to read Deleuze and Guattari and obliterate the idea of desire as it would be to read Freud and obliterate the idea of pleasure. Like, how could you possibly arrive at a notion of psychoanalysis if you first of all decided that pleasure isn't important? It's to me, that's a sort of kind of conceptual nonsense. But nonetheless, you know, Deleuze has his models and he uses it to analyze different things. I think probably I would say that the difference between 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus has to do with the idea of how the desiring machines are formulated. And so it's not really that the first book is a book of desire and the second book isn't. They're both books of desire. But in the first book, there's a couple of things that I think that are crucial and that change as we get to the second book. So one thing is the idea of the body without organs. So in Anti-Oedipus, the body without organs is essentially a negative concept. They describe it as the kind of end state of desire. This is what desire looks like when it's kind of everything shut down, okay? But when you get to 1,000 Plateaus, they have kind of revised their view of that. And now they say there is both an affirmative and a negative version of the body without organs. There's kind of a cancerous version, there's a healthy version. And also the other thing they say, which is quite interesting, is that we can change our bodies without organs, as it were. So in the first book, they talk about Artaud, and his body without organs is more or less a reaction to the world. Like they take it from the poem. He basically says, I can't deal with the world as it is. I can't deal with these organs. So I'm going to have a body without organs, which is kind of like saying, you know, the world just pisses me off. So you know, I'm not going to engage with the world anymore. I'm going to turn inwards and become catatonic and disengage. But then what they say in 1,000 Plateaus is that's not the only option, that we can in fact have an affirmative form of a body without organs. And in that sense, the concept becomes completely different. And a whole new layer is added into it when you get to the chapter where they say, how do you make yourself a body without organs? And now we start to think that the body without organs really is a kind of, how I try to think about it is it's the condition of possibility, okay? And you can think of this in terms of, for me, I think about it in terms of depression. So when somebody says that they're depressed, in a sense, what they're saying is that the condition of possibility for them to get out of bed in the morning and to face the world is simply missing in their life. And all the therapies that we try to come up with are really therapies that try to help them to create this new affirmative body without organs that would give them the condition of possibility to get out of bed in the morning and to face the day. And I think that's a really, really interesting insight within 1,000 Plateaus that hasn't really been dealt with at any real length. And it's certainly something that has always fascinated me. The fact that you can make, or that you can actively kind of influence your conditions of possibility in the world. And this is a really affirmative idea within this concept, which begins very negatively. And I think that's what's really crucial. In Anti-Oedipus, it's a very negative concept. It refers to a kind of catatonic state. But by the time we get to 1,000 Plateaus, they've turned it around completely, and it has become possible for it to be an affirmative concept. The concept of the desiring machine, they're quite explicit in saying they abandoned the terminology, but they didn't abandon the idea. And what's interesting is if you compare 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus, the word agissement is there in the original French, but it disappears in the translation. And so we don't recognize, if we're only reading it in English, we don't recognize that assemblages are being talked about, particularly towards the end of the book, but they vanish in the English version. So if you go back and look at the French, think, oh, okay, wait, they really were talking about assemblages in the first book, but in a kind of non-formalized way. And so when you get to A Thousand Plateaus, you realize that what happened between Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus is they began to formalize this concept that they use in a quite loose way, particularly in the final chapter of Anti-Oedipus. And I think, Deleuze and Guattari say in an interview, I think it's following the Milan conference, where they sort of say, we felt people kind of understood desiring machines too much, they're too readily, and were kind of using it, and that people really need to get their own concepts. And I think the other part about it, which is also kind of there as well, is that the desiring machines in Anti-Oedipus are more or less explicitly sexual and more or less explicitly related to Freud and to Freudian ideas of the complex. And you notice that in one of the glossaries that Guattari prepares, he in fact says the idea of the assemblage comes from the notion of the complex in psychoanalysis. They've just translated complex as agencement, and there we get the movement towards what we think of as the assemblage today. So I think they wanted to move away from the strictly psychosexual idea that desiring machines tend to be about. And that's kind of already evident in their example that they give, where they're talking about Beckett and the stones sort of circulating through his pockets. And they say, well, how can we understand this, sucking of stones and moving it from one pocket to another pocket and so forth? How can we understand this in psychosexual terms? And likewise, how do we understand, the so-called handyman who likes to fix up the house on the weekend? And can we understand getting out your power drill and putting up new shelving in terms of it, in psychosexual terms? And in a sense, they say, well, perhaps we can't. And I think from that point of view, we then move from desiring machines as a psychosexual construction to assemblage as a desire construction, but no longer limited by ideas of the psychosexual, and it becomes a much freer concept, and we are able to then think about new rules for its formation and new ways by which it functions and holds together.
Manoj, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, my question to you, Jan, is about, one of the most perplexing questions for me was what is not an assemblage, but what is not an assemblage? Because that is where, I try to ask many people when we conduct the camps and all, I just want to know what is not an assemblage. Because when you have the discussion on actor network theory, or if you read Jane Bennett or anything, it's like you kind of tend to see things as an assemblage. For me, the question was, what is not an assemblage? If there can be questions like that. So in that context, in your book, you are referring to, actually, you say in an argument against Deleuze, you say that assemblages have certain essential, it is essential, quintessentially. So what do you exactly mean by that? Is there an essential character to it? And one more question that I would like to add with it, if you want to think of a particular thing as an assemblage, does it need to be functional? Is it that functional part which differs assemblage from something, what you call a network or something? Because, for example, if you look at a car, the car itself is an assemblage. If it's punctured or something, will it still be called a car as an assemblage or not?
Okay, so, brilliant question. What is not an assemblage? And I think it's a question that I thought about a lot too, because one of the things that motivated me to write my book was the fact that everything was being described as an assemblage. And eventually I thought, well, if everything's an assemblage, then what does the concept of the assemblage do for us? If it doesn't help us to differentiate one thing from another thing, because they're just all assemblages, we could just call everything objects, and it would be just as useless. So one of the most crucial examples then in A Thousand Plateaus is that they say language is not an assemblage. Now, that is perhaps the most important example that they give. But if they say language is not an assemblage, but we can construct assemblages with language, then that helps us to distinguish very clearly, what can be an assemblage and what isn't an assemblage. And I think that's kind of crucial. So language is not an assemblage because it exists if you like, below the level at which assemblages can form. And then this goes to the other part about the idea of the, below is perhaps the wrong word, but on a different realm or a different plane, the essentialism. I mean, essentialism, I think, has kind of got a bad rap, but there is no reason in principle why philosophically we should simply reject the possibility of essentialism or of things being essential. And it has a bad rap with good reason, because it has been mobilized, for example, to say that there are essential differences between the sexes, essential differences between the races, essential differences between the classes. And these have been used to justify, all kinds of bigoted, racist, etc. ways of thinking about the world. And obviously we should have no kind of compunction about rejecting those ways of thinking. But I mean, Deleuze and Guattari would effectively say all those ways of using essentialism are simply not abstract enough. So the problem is within their application, not within the kind of foundation of the idea. Because the flip side, to lose all forms of essentialism is equally problematic. If we lose all forms of essentialism, and if there's nothing essentially different between something that is living and something that is not, between a rock and a human, then we kind of lose the grounds for our ethics. Why should we save the life of a human versus, crushing a rock? If there's no intrinsic essential difference between those two entities, then our whole ethics collapses. And it seems to me that any ontology that just simply throws ethics out the window is not an ontology that I'm much interested in. I think that the real complexity of thought comes when we try to combine our ontology and our ethics and recognize that we do in fact want a version of an ontology that privileges human life. Now, some people may extend that and say that they want to privilege all forms of life, and maybe that's correct as well. But there are limits to that as well, right? Like, vegetarians say they don't want to kill animals, fine, I have no problem with that, but they kind of eat vegetables, which are animate. And so where and how do we draw the distinction between these things? Now, these may not be essential distinctions, they may be political distinctions, but nonetheless, we are in the realm whereby we are willing to make these distinctions and to build a politics around them. Because if we didn't, how could we justify the idea that we ought to save lives, that should be the principle of a politics? And to me, that really should be one of the key principles of a politics. And I think one of the things that we would be thinking about in response to how the COVID pandemic has been handled by different governments has really been the extent to which they privilege and prioritize all human lives. Or do they, give priority to business, or do they give priority to capitalism in general? And the countries where they haven't prioritized all human lives have had catastrophic death tolls. And so I think it's a fairly, for me, a fairly easy position to adopt. Now, the thing is, though, Deleuze and Guattari do preserve a radical, essential distinction between the inanimate, the animate, and the semiotic. So in the chapter on strata, they are very clear that each of these things, the geological, the biological, and the semiotic, if you like, are composed differently, and that they have essential differences between them. That the rock cannot become a living thing. The living thing cannot magically turn into a semiotic thing. Like, yes, we can attach semiotic meanings to it, but the frog doesn't become a word that we can, speak out of our mouth or whatever. These things cannot change their form in this essential way. We can, and matter doesn't disappear either. You kind of can't make rocks just vanish or become something else. They can change their form, but they can't change their essence and become this new thing. And so I think that's really, that is essential. And it's an essentialism at the heart of what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do. What I think is interesting about this and what makes it useful for us is it then asks the question, well, how do these things hold together? How do these things operate together? And what binds them together? And that really is the idea of the assemblage. And so to give you an example from my own research, I've been working with some scholars here in Australia on cycling. And so, one of the things we've talked about is cycling is a combination of infrastructure, which is inanimate. It's roads, it's bike paths, it's whatever. But also it's bodies that are riding those bikes. And it's the sort of semiotic meanings we attach to those bikes. And so in a project that I worked on with my colleague, Glenn Fuller, we were very interested in the ways by which the deaths of cyclists in road accidents were reported and then responded to by people in Australia. And, you know, if we had a Facebook post where they're talking about somebody who has been killed, 2/3 of those responses would be affirmative and sympathetic and as you would expect, but at least 1/3 would be entirely hostile. People saying that the cyclists shouldn't be on the road, they therefore deserve to die, they should pay registration, and et cetera, et cetera. Like you wouldn't believe just how completely heartless these responses are. But it really does beg the question, like, what is it about somebody getting onto a bike and riding on a road that suddenly makes their life not worth living? They become, you know, in the sort of, you know, Agamben sense, the sort of sacrificial life, that their lives should not be mourned, they shouldn't be grieved, shouldn't have been there anyway. And that's what I was talking about before when I said that the concepts intervene. So here, the fact that cyclists are regarded as a kind of life not worth saving, a life not worth living, means that they are not grieved even when they are killed by a segment of society. And so I think, for me, assemblages are useful for us to try to think about this as a kind of complex interaction between spaces and bodies and attitudes, and how these things bind together in a way that, you know, end up in people getting killed, end up in their lives not being mourned, and by the same token, in ways by which we think about how our society should be organized, to give priority, for example, to speed. So one of the reasons why cyclists are hated is because they slow down traffic. You know, in a country like Australia, where if traffic can't travel at 100 kilometres an hour, it's just, you know, it's obviously a moral outrage, and the cyclists should just be kind of gotten rid of. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope so.
A brilliant answer.
Well, let me just go back to the idea of method in your book. I mean, what is the nature of the methodology of assemblage theory? Is it a political theory you're doing? Is it a social critique? Is it a sociology? Is it anthropology? What is the kind of discipline, or is it a new discipline you're putting forward as part of assemblage theory?
I don't think I would be able to classify what discipline it is. And certainly when you read Francois Doss's kind of combined biography of Deleuze and Guattari, and you read how they wrote Anti-Oedipus, it was very clear that they drew on the work of their friends who were sociologists, the work of their friends who were anthropologists, and so on. So I think, you know, kind of all the disciplines of the humanities were drawn in. Whether or not they resulted in a methodology that we could easily follow is an open question, and the single most important and cogent complaint about my book is that it's pretty light on in the method department, which makes me think I should probably write a sequel that was called Assemblage Method and Theory, maybe get the priorities around the other way or something like that. But in terms of what I think methodologically it's trying to do is to try to find the means to uncover presuppositions. The things that we kind of presuppose, but don't really know, or don't really know how we can make them visible, but nevertheless we know they underpin our daily existence. And that's sort of what I was talking about before with respect to our cycling research. We became very interested in the way by which this notion of speed underpins how people will respond to cyclists, and that there's this kind of privileging and prioritizing of the idea of going fast. And if you think about the constructions of roads within first world cities in particular, they have tried to prioritize speed at the expense of all other human things. And so famously, in New York, they put through these huge kind of freeways through the middle of the city, and they broke up whole neighborhoods and sort of destroyed the livelihood which has been written about extensively. But the point is that they prioritize the idea of being able to move fast in a car. And likewise, the old idea of the village, within Australia, the old idea of the village, same in Britain, they just put freeways that bypass them. And so villages just kind of shriveled and died as places where people went to go and interacted. Likewise, I remember when I was living in the UK, they talked a lot about the fact that the high street had been kind of killed by the mall, because people wanted to drive their car to the mall and go shopping there. They didn't want the hassle of trying to find parking on the high street. So, you know, in pursuit of this idea of moving fast, we've been willing to destroy the cultural fabric of our cities that have been extant for hundreds of years. And to me, that's a really, really powerful idea, like the willingness with which we do that. And growing up in Australia, like if you go to my hometown of Perth, I mean, they would demolish anything to put a freeway through it. It doesn't matter how sacred the site is, how ancient the site is, how historical or natural value or anything, they would just put a freeway through it. You know, people joke in Australia, if you want to get elected, all you have to do is promise to build a road. And, you know, again, it's this idea that you're just prioritizing this moving fast, but it's a kind of inhuman way of thinking about the city. And I think that's what Virilio was getting at. And it's pretty clear that Deleuze and Guattari were kind of great admirers of Virilio's work on speed. But for us to understand that, what we have to really get a sense of is the way by which this, it's not just the physical fact of moving fast, but rather the absolute privilege given to moving fast, by which we would then reorganize the city. But if you think about it, we also are burning all these fossil fuels in the pursuit of being able to move fast. And thereby we are willing to kill the planet in order to keep moving fast. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me, you know, schizoanalysis is about trying to uncover these kinds of presuppositions and trying to figure out how did they become so embedded in our culture that we can't possibly give up the idea of moving fast all the time, and that we're willing to let the planet die around us rather than give up on that idea.
Guys, on it, Manoj?
As a to Job's question, I would like to ask you another important question is like, have you ever thought of a Dilution Ontology of the social? Because he was also referring to it, like, you know, where do you posit this assemblage as a political, social, or like, especially in the context of Latourian work on reassembling the social something, he's like, is there any possibility of a Dilution Ontology of the social? Have you ever thought about it?
Oh, yes, I've certainly thought about it. I don't think it would look the same as Latour's version of it. I think that the foundations of an ontology of the social are in the third chapter of Anti-Oedipus, where they map out the distinction between savages, barbarians, and civilized men. And the idea there is, I think that they talk about the way by which, in effect, belief captures desire, and the more powerful that capture of desire, the more binding it is for that particular kind of society. So their ontology of society really is at that level. And they say in Anti-Oedipus, there are only two flows, the flow of desire and the flow of belief. And that one captures the other and the other liberates the other. So when they talk about desire as a kind of liberating force, what they really mean is that desire is capable of throwing off the shackles of belief. But nevertheless, they seem to think that, and this would be, you know, something that we could probably push them on a bit more and develop a more sophisticated version. But they seem to be of the view that we kind of can't handle the idea of desire in the complete absence of belief. You know, so that's why the schizophrenic is kind of scary to us, because their version of desire seems to be unshackled by belief, or it has their own belief system that is so powerfully different from ours as non-schizophrenics that we can't recognize it and we can't engage with it. But I think that's probably for me, that would be where, if we were going to develop something out of Deleuze and Guattari and push it beyond where they got to, it would be at that intersection between belief and desire, and the way by which desire is seen as a kind of solvent of belief that nevertheless is constantly recaptured by belief. I mean, there is this kind of binary at the heart of their work that people like Jameson have pointed to, but most Deleuzians have been very reluctant to kind of dip their fingers into and kind of figure out what we should actually do with that. We seem quite happy to talk about things being deterritorialized, reterritorialized, as though somehow that was just a kind of natural thing like evolution. I think that's probably the unsophisticated heart of Deleuze and Guattari, and if we were to kind of move beyond them, that's where I would want to start.
Let me jump in there. So you mentioned schizoanalysis, so we probably should try and think about how to put schizoanalysis and with assemblage theory. So, but when I read your work, I always think that you're doing a kind of a social critique, really, and then you're trying to use the method of assemblage theory or to use the concept of schizoanalysis to understand the kind of the fragility of desire, almost, or even its collapse. So, and you do make political kind of commentary on, you know, young people and the relationship with technology and things like that. And I know Deleuze and Guattari do talk about capitalism somehow ruining desire, or even ruining the desire of young people, leading you know, young people to be kind of cut off from the world and to kind of turn in on themselves. And you know, as you know, Ian, you talked about it before, about the problems of young people in Japan, the hikikomori syndrome, of young people who kind of isolate from the world, and all the modern kind of problems we have, like suicidal kind of impulses of young people seem to be increasing. So I think in some ways the Landers theory of assemblage has no kind of like commentary or perspective on that, whereas your theory definitely does. And that, I think in some way, that's what I was asking you about, the method and how you would think the method of assemblage theory and schizoanalysis together to make up a kind of new idea. Because it seems to me that, you know, you do argue that desire is manufactured, okay? Yeah. And you do say that, you know, where is it manufactured, okay? Where is our desires kind of manufactured? Now, I presume you're not going to introduce the concept of ideology and somehow how ideology masks where desire is manufactured. But I guess your idea is something to think about schizoanalysis, or your method of assemblage theory, of asking about, asking where is desire? Where is it that it's manufactured? You see? And then when I read your work, I'm always thinking about Zizek and, you know, disavowal and ideology concepts and things like that. But I guess schizoanalysis is different. So I guess I would like to ask you a question about assemblage theory. How asking the question something like, is desire, does it remain explosive? Is it, or has it been exhausted? It seems, and if we can put it like that, then we can have the idea of a kind of constructivism of desire, where we have to kind of make our assemblages that allow us to kind of retain some kind of circuits of energy. And maybe then we can transform these circuits and these assemblages for the better. So how does schizoanalysis, a kind of a new account of a schizoanalysis using your assemblage theory, how does it account for kind of the problems, social problems, which kind of springing up in the today?
I mean, you don't ask the easy questions. Look, I think that, you know, yes, I have read a lot of Zizek, and I suppose the fundamental difference between Deleuze and Guattari and Zizek would have to do with the conception of desire, the degree to which desire can function in a kind of a pure state, and also the degree to which desire has to be understood as a kind of involuntary force, as something that flows through us over which we have no control. I think, you know, Zizek's model of desire is very much on the spectrum of the kind of involuntary force, and that we have to kind of make negotiations with that. And that's where the sort of disavowal and negations and so forth come into it, that we have to sort of make a bargain with our desire. And for him, he kind of adapts the model of Lacan, whereby when desire escapes all of those masks, we kind of find it traumatic. I don't think Deleuze and Guattari think of it in the same way. And I think that the difference is it's not so much a rejection of that idea, but rather a kind of transformation of it to say, desire cannot exist in a pure state. Like they always say, if it existed in a pure state, it would cause everything to blow up. And maybe that is true. But they also seem to be saying it simply cannot exist in a sort of so-called pure state. It can only exist as an assemblage, but it can only exist as an organization. So desire is not simply a kind of current of electricity that flows through us. And they're very clear. They say we cannot think of desire as simply an undifferentiated energy. Okay? And in a sense, that's the most extreme form of psychoanalysis, that desire is an undifferentiated form of energy and we have to negotiate with it, etc. They say, no, it's not that. It's a kind of constructive, organizing force, that it doesn't exist just floating out there like something in the ether. Rather, it exists as something that is organized and that we mobilize in order to function in everyday life. But we don't have complete control over it. So there is a dimension that is involuntary, or we could say unconscious, but I think it's the involuntary dimension of the idea of desire that is the most crucial, because it's not simply that we don't know about it or don't have access to it, but rather it makes us do things that we find inexplicable. And so there is an involuntary dimension to it. Now, we know from reading the biography of Guattari that he conducted a private psychotherapy, that he worked with patients at Laborde and so forth. Unfortunately, as far as I know, the notes from his private patients are not available. They may have been destroyed. I don't know the answer to that question at all. But it would be super fascinating if those notes existed, in the same way Freud's notes were destroyed as well, which is one of the most catastrophic losses to psychoanalysis. It would be amazing if those notes were somewhere found and we could look at them. We can kind of get a glimpse of what his psychotherapy, the premises of his psychotherapy in the existing published work. And to me, it seems to boil down to this kind of one fairly simple idea, which is that the absolutely crucial thing is that we do not get stuck. And so they have this idea of the black hole, and the black hole would be a kind of an assemblage of desire in which we get stuck and we don't know how to get out of. It could be a highly obsessive kind of thought, a repetitive practice that we can't seem to shake, the sense of failure or whatever. And this is a black hole. And we fall into that black hole. We talk about the black pits of despair, etc., etc. But for Deleuze and Guattari, he saw that as a black hole in the sense of it had its, and he says this explicitly, it has its own ecstasies, that there are reasons why we sink into these black holes. And then this is then where the concept of the rhizome comes into being. And it's a fairly misunderstood concept, but what they say is when you are in a black hole, being able to make a connection with anything is your only way out of the black hole. And so therefore, the power of the rhizome is in effect your way out of the black hole. Once you can begin to make a connection between this really negative thing with some other positive thing, and then you can slowly climb your way out of the black hole. And all kinds of psychotherapy today follow exactly that modality. That people go to see the therapist and they say, I just feel completely terrible about my life. There's nothing good in it. It's just all awful. And they may genuinely feel that. And then so the first thing the therapist tries to do is to say to them, well, what about this thing in your life? Do you feel positive about that? And then they might say, well, kind of, yeah, I think I sort of do. And then the therapeutic process is trying to work out, how do you get from being in a pit of despair to grabbing a hold of this thing that you do still kind of value and think, well, how do I climb towards that? And that's the idea of the rhizome, is being able to make a connection from out of a pit of despair into something else, and from there to something more positive. And that's where we get back to the idea of the body, that organs becoming an affirmative concept, whereby you can undertake to do practices that will thereby enable you to become more positive about your daily life. And again, we find this permeates all forms of psychotherapy today, whereby people say, look, you don't have to believe that things have got better. And Zizek says this all the time. But if you start acting like they've got better, then pretty soon they start to get better in some cases. But that's precisely the same thing that Deleuze and Guattari are saying, that our practices can, not in all cases, of course, but can change our mindset, change our sense of possibility in the world. And so I think that what they were really interested in as a sort of therapeutic model was the degree to which practices could enable someone to change how they feel about the world, how they relate to the world. And they give a few examples of that. So, for example, they talk about schizophrenic patients, and this one patient they said who announces one day that he wants to learn how to drive a car, and having been catatonic for years. And they say, you know, of course it's impossible. He was never going to drive a car. No one was ever going to let him drive a car out on the streets or anything like that. But to say no at that point would have been problematic. And Guattari introduces this idea of the vista of possibility. And to me, this is, you know, another one of those underrated but super important concepts. And what he says is that by encouraging this person to think that they're going to drive and to go through the motions of learning to drive, it opened up a vista of possibility that had previously not been there. So I think that there's a kind of an untheorized dimension to their psychotherapy that boils down to something fairly simple, which is that so long as we can keep moving, so long as we don't get stuck in one assemblage, then actually we can kind of consider ourselves to be doing fine. And so maybe that's kind of the key when we think about, you know, young people being drawn into their phones, and we talk about them falling into their phones and that sort of thing. Well, they're getting stuck. You know, the richness of their life and the richness of the possibilities of their life are being dramatically curtailed. And so the rhizomatic thing that we want them to do is to move away from the screen. Like, you know, all the versions of the rhizome that have been talked about with respect to digital technology has been all the rhizomes that take place within the screen. But in a way, that's failing to understand the rhizome. The rhizome shouldn't take you deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. It should take you out of the labyrinth. So insofar as you're looking at the screen non-stop, you have not got onto your rhizome. Your rhizome has to take you away from the screen.
That's an excellent kind of description. Taekwon.
Yeah, can I jump in? All right, just you talk about kind of personal therapy, you know, the by you know, the escaping such a the psychoanalytic framework, but yeah, I want to actually move, you know, this, you know, topic to a more political one. Is the Thousand Plateau, in my opinion, is more like bringing a kind of, you know, anti-fascist, you know, politics, because they very clearly actually the put down their aim of, you know, such the philosophy is the create political philosophy is so if actually the many enemy of the critique of Deleuze and Guattari, you know, raise a question about their, you know, politics, Badiou and Ramsey, and then even Isabella Garot, and then they actually mostly actually the from a point of Marxism, saying you know, the Deleuze and Guattari has no politics, or you know, in particular actually Deleuze regarded actually Deleuze as kind of pure philosopher. I don't know what actually pure philosopher means, but actually the thing is that you know, in Thousand Plateau they very actually, you know, clarified the meaning of anti-fascism, the relevant to assemblage, and then in French might be agencement is in this sense desire must be understood as kind of ontological term, you know, rather than the psychoanalytic, you know, as you said, the kind of the byproduct of a symbolic, you know, dimension. The more actually the ontological one is a kind of a concept, you know, close to the Spinozist sense of conatus. Is if you exist, you would have a desire, or so you exist as kind of desire towards something. But this is very important if you understand fascism, right? Is the already Job wrote about this one is by quoting the William Reich, and then they try to actually the understand fascist politics by the term of this kind of desire. But in my opinion, Deleuze and Guattari would think such a psychoanalytic approach to fascism might be failed because of lack of this kind of understanding of desire as an ontological dimension. So that's why just if I want to actually ask you that if you want to say the political philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari must be called anti-fascist, politics or anti-fascist, the philosophy. How could you actually bring in, such a practical agenda, from this sort of ontological, concept of assemblage? That is my question.
Yeah, look, it's an important question. I'm not sure that I would want to describe their work as simply anti-fascist. I mean, I think that's Foucault's, his introduction to Anti-Oedipus really framed the book in that way. But I think there's a kind of another dimension to it, which again doesn't get talked about, and whenever I talk about it, people get mad at me. But there is a kind of a moment where they're talking about what Perry Anderson referred to as the defeat of the left. I mean, if we think about May 68, it is a moment of the defeat of the left. Now, what does it mean by that? What did Perry Anderson mean by that? What he meant was that they had reached the moment and the point at which, and there's several meanings to it, but perhaps the most important one is that there is no possibility of revolution. Like there is never going to be a leftist revolution. As far as, I'm willing to make this prediction, there's not going to be a leftist revolution anytime soon, because the powers of the police are so astronomical that it would be suicide. I mean, if we thought that the barricades of May 68 were problematic, imagine what we have seen already in the US last year, what the US police is capable of deploying against peaceful protests. Imagine if those protests had been violent. There is not going to be a violent revolution from the left. So one of the first understandings we have to have of what the left means today is that it is, in a military sense, it's defeated. Like there is not going to be a revolution. Now, if there can't be, a violent uprising in order to bring about the socialist dream, then what is going to bring it about? And the other thing that Deleuze and Guattari says, well, we're not going to have a revolution, but neither are we going to get there by reform. Neither reform nor revolution. And, one version of this would be, well, neoliberalism is what happens when you try to get a revolution by reform. It suits the right. It does not suit the left. What the right have done is to simply dismantle all the things that the left had managed to create through mass walkouts and strikes, et cetera, all the kind of worker protections and the welfare structures and everything that have been built up to the period of the 1960s have since then been systematically dismantled. And one of the great things about Foucault's lectures, which people don't talk about, but the book Society Must Be Defended and the one that follows, The Biopolitics, there's so much about neoliberalism in there. Like he's talking about German neoliberalism. It's the most brilliant book about neoliberalism that I have ever read. I mean, he's talking about this stuff like 20 years before David Harvey starts talking about it. And he's saying exactly all these things. He goes through all the kind of problems that neoliberalism confronts and says, well, you say, the left says we should have more government. We say more government is a problem. We should have less government. And if we have less government, we can deal with these kinds of problems. And again, that goes back to the idea of the intervention of concepts. Neoliberalism was one at a conceptual level. And the concepts and the sort of conceptual battles that took place have had real consequences in the world, impoverishing consequences for many, many people in the world as well. Again, which goes back to my point earlier, is that we really need our students to step up and win these conceptual battles because they have real effects. So I think it's important to see that the anti-fascist part about it is only one element of it. But to me, the bigger element is, well, what the fuck does the left do now that it has been defeated? if it cannot start a revolution, if it can't reform, well, where does it go from here? Well, where does it go from here? Its only real route is a kind of critical route, which is to systematically try to dismantle the assumptions that the right has been able to push onto us, and to really make us conscious of the things that the right has done in order to guarantee their sort of sovereignty, if you like. Of which I would point to just, one really crucial example, which is tax cuts. Like since when Reagan came to power, when Thatcher came to power in Australia with John Howard and so forth, once they started to cut taxes, they effectively took away the power of the left to propose a kind of tax and spend liberal ideology that would provide welfare, that would build hospitals and schools and have free university tuition and so forth. They took away that as a possibility. And then they offered back the idea that the market will provide and that the user should pay. And the left has had no answer to that. And if you wonder why the left is defeated, it's because they have not been able to answer that simple, but enormously destructive idea, which is that the user should pay. And like I say to my students, like this year, all the students that start arts degrees had their fees increased by 117% from what was charged last year. Just absolutely unbelievable. But I say to them, who benefits from you getting a degree? Is it you or is it your employer? And initially they start by saying, well, obviously it's me that benefits from me getting a degree because I get a good job and I get a good salary and so forth. And then I say to them, but your employer must be earning more money from your labor than you are ever going to earn. Otherwise they couldn't afford to hire you. So in fact, they're benefiting more than you are. So why shouldn't they pay for you to get a degree? And obviously they start to think, well, maybe they should pay for me to get a degree. And this idea of benefit and of value, these are powerfully destructive ideas, and they have become pervasive in our society. And another example is, in the UK, they have been absolutely aghast at this, the so-called postcode lottery. If you live in one local government area and the drug you need to save your life is available in that local area, then you get it for free. You live across the river in a different local government area where that drug is not part of that local government area's model, you die. And it's as simple and as stark and as horrible as that. Well, what kind of a model of society would we have or would we want that had that as one of its intrinsic constructions? And yet that is the model of society that we have. And it seems to me those are the kinds of questions that Deleuze and Guattari would want us to ask. I don't know that we necessarily need to kind of dress it up and say, well, it's anti-fascist. I think, no, it's about looking at these kinds of absolutely inhuman constructions and ask, how did they get there? Why do we still have them? And why don't we burn the place down rather than have them? To me, that's what a Deleuzean politics would look like.
Would you like to respond, Tai Kwang?
Yeah, actually, very plausible. It's very plausible, and for me, thing is that what I mean, actually, that kind of the transformation of capitalism, that is my actual argument. Ended up with the so-called, the new fascism. These days is that kind of new trend of fascism. Mostly actually called the populism, but in my opinion, it's very soft fascism. It's already transformed fascism. And according to my reading of Thousand Plato, and then aftermath, also Deleuze wrote those things in his cinema book. His cinema book is not really actually book about cinema. It's a kind of in my opinion, it's better politics. But anyway, just that's why I thought the Deleuze and Guattari would try to anticipate the kind of advent of this new era of fascism. Is capitalism needs fascism. I never seen any the philosopher who talk like that in his contemporary. What I mean, actually they actually said the fascism is kind of the foundation of capitalism. Is like because as you said, the capitalism is kind of schizophrenic, but the bourgeois and then this upper class, ruling class needs, sort of, the material foundation of, to bring this, schizophrenic power together. That's why I say it's a kind of, the apparatus, So that's why just I raised such a question. Well, anyway, just you the proposal. Of course, yes. Actually, they don't want to actually criticize the fascism as such, but how such a desire is a permissive power could be, actually the captured by those, the political machine, so-called, fascism. That's it's very, in my opinion, their approach is quite different from such a psychoanalytic, approach to fascism. Is away from, actually many, psychoanalytic Freudian, Marxist, try to analyze, fascism, Marcuse, and then many, critical, theory. But in my opinion, they didn't put forward properly, the critique, full critique, the total critique of fascism, because they simply criticize, the fascist, politics. For instance, the Adorno, Adorno's, the criticism, his criticism of the Heidegger, for instance, he tried to find out the inner logic within the Heideggerian philosophy, but in some place like Iran, for instance, actually the Heidegger actually functioned quite different. Heidegger philosophy served, as kind of a revolutionary spirit, by which the Iranian, revolutionary and try to to bring in their own republic, the country, even though actually it was overtaken by the fundamental Islamism. But thing is that when they actually started their kind of revolution, they used that kind of philosophy in different way. Even though Heidegger actually supported Nazi, but in Iran, the Heidegger was used, by those Iranian revolutionary to support Republican, what I mean, actually authenticity of their own politics. So anyway, just that ought support when you discuss, in terms of assemblage. What I mean, like philosophy functions. It's not kind of theory, it's like it's not like a meta theory, by which we analyze or some examine, the in the society, and then some kind of phenomenon is definitely we need to approach the kind of the production, through the perspective of the radical position. That is, in my opinion, Deleuze and Guattari's position. Try to do that. So that's why just these days very timely. We need to reread, Deleuze and Guattari, in particular in the Thousand Plateau. That's why actually I'm very loved the one you did in your book. All right. So right.
Can I continue that? Because well, as you know, next year is the 50th anniversary of Anti-Oedipus. So I think Ian's just been talking about what happened in the wake of 1968 and how politics kind of was transformed and how neoliberalism came to dominate. So I think, given the fact that it's going to be the 50th anniversary, we have to look at the future of schizoanalysis. You can say the future of assemblage theory. And, of course, in Anti-Oedipus, they say we haven't seen anything yet regarding what schizoanalysis can do. So I'm wondering whether we perhaps have seen what schizoanalysis can do. So that means that the future tasks of schizoanalysis seems to me in need of a radical rethink, because it seems to me that we've been discussing about desire and whether desire is it revolutionary, or what's happened to desire because we've come to abide with neoliberalism and the manufacture of desire in that way. So it seems to me like the idea of philosophers of desire, you could say Deleuze perhaps is a philosopher of desire. Perhaps this philosophy is dead, and an anarchist désirant, they are no more, and the generational effect of 1968 is all but gone. So in terms of an assemblage theory, your book seems to me that you do much more to analyze the social problems which are occurring in drastic ways in our kind of capitalist societies. So I'm wondering, how would you respond to this kind of idea that we need a new kind of schizoanalysis, a new kind of philosophy of desire?
I guess I don't think we need a new kind of schizoanalysis, because I would probably be happy to, well, not happy is the wrong word, I would be okay with saying that we have yet to realize what a schizoanalysis could really look like. And I think that we're still not there yet in terms of how that might work for us. Partly because we still, there's a lot of arguments about what this term means and what that term means and that sort of thing. And I mean, I guess for me, the advantage of becoming old is that I have reached a point in my thinking about certain things where I'm kind of clear in my mind that it means this and it means that. And it enables me to get to the point of being constructive with things. You know, if this means that, then we can say this. You know, if we can't agree on the basic terms of the conversation, then we just spend all our time kind of arguing about, you know, semantics, which is not particularly productive. I mean, I would suggest that the next evolutionary step within schizoanalysis will be to recognize that the most interesting, important, and useful aspect of it is to think about the fact of competing desires. Now, the reason why I would say that they don't think of themselves as being anti-fascist, and they don't really talk about anti-fascism in any strict way, is because it's not complicated enough. And, you know, the kind of discussion about the idea of the molecular in 1,000 Plateaus is super interesting. And in a sense, they start out by saying, well, you know, the only philosophical question is, you know, why do people desire against their interests? And eventually what they conclude, and again, people don't seem to read this far into the book and find this part of the answer, is that they say people do not desire against their interests, that they don't desire against their interests. Rather, what happens is that their desire gets fragmented and they end up desiring mutually exclusive things. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, but if you think about Trump and the idea of make America great again, like we also think, you know, Trump is obviously a fascist. No one is really disputing that. But, you know, on the face of it, if somebody said make America great again, who doesn't want to vote for that? Like in principle, who doesn't want to vote for that, right? But what does that greatness mean? How will it be measured? What will it look like? Well, that's completely, you know, up for grabs, open to question. And I imagine if you were to interview a whole bunch of people, you know, who voted for Trump, that their version of what American greatness would look like would vary quite dramatically. You know, like for the women who voted for Trump, despite the fact that he, you know, was blatantly sexist and misogynistic and et cetera, you ask them, well, how did they arrive at that position? How did they think that it was okay to vote for Trump, given that he was completely misogynistic? So clearly, you know, the way by which contemporary politics work is that there are competing desires and that people trade off. Okay, yeah, he's a fascist and he's an asshole, but he's going to make America great again. So that's good, right? So let's vote for him. You know, politics is like that nowadays, and it's really, really hard. And what happens is that, you know, certain things get boiled down and become really important. We saw with Brexit that, you know, Johnson basically said, look, fuck it, we're going to just exit Europe, come hell or high water. And everybody was like, well, look, we're sick of Labor dithering about this. We're just going to get it done. Whatever that meant. Like it's the most moronic position that they could possibly have taken. It's going to be a catastrophe for at least a decade. But people were just like, yeah, we're sick of arguing about it, talking about it, whatever. So these competing political ideas and demands, it's not between the left and the right. It's like between the left and the right side of the same brain. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari talk about, this kind of interference they talk about. The left and the right are kind of meaningless now. What we have instead is these kind of complex compositions of positions that are largely incoherent, unintelligible, that are schizophrenic. That just make no sense. You know, you can't sort of rationalize them away. Like, why was building a wall against Mexico such a vote winner? Like, to the point where Mexicans who now reside in America actually voted for Trump in the most recent election because they benefited from the wall being built and they had jobs in ICE keeping people out of the US, like competing demands. That every aspect of their lives should have meant that they would be anti-Trump, but in fact they benefited directly from those fascistic policies. So to me, schizoanalysis would be trying to figure out how do these completely, not just contradictory, but absolutely opposite, negating desires exist side by side in a form that people themselves think of as being coherent.
Right.
Well, Manoj, you probably should jump in here, but I was wondering about the time because we're going to be up for an hour and a half.
Tom, we have a question in the live chat.
Good.
Masayuki was is from Canada. Can I read it?
Yes,
please.
Yeah.
I was trying to see if I could read it, but I can't.
Could you, Ian discusses the concept investment a bit in chapter 2 of his book. I would appreciate any exegesis of it. And I wonder what would entail if I said disinvestment in Deleuze and Guattari's sense. There's a question.
Right. So the idea of investment, the original French was investissement, which has been translated as investment, which we tend to think of as meaning a kind of financial investment. But the original meaning can also mean occupation. And the original German word, so it's the translation of Besetzung, could also mean occupation, likewise cathexis. So investissement, now investment, actually is cathexis for the people who read Freud, and it's the kind of the weird Greek terms that the Strachey's introduced into Freud. But if we go back to the idea of Trump and build a wall and lock her up and all that sort of thing, those are all cathectic moments within politics, right? That, in a standard psychoanalysis, we would see them as cathectic moments. So these are moments of investment. Why do people invest so much in that idea? And the flip side of that, of course, is why didn't Trump, or why didn't his opposition, why didn't Biden, or before that Hillary, why didn't they come out and say, we're going to build hospitals, we're going to make education free for everybody, we're going to have a brilliant immigrant program? Why did that not attract the same level of investment? So one of the great mysteries of the 21st century is that politicians do not seem to be able to get elected by offering to do good things for people. They can only get elected by offering to do bad things, by locking them up, by locking them out, by taking away their pension, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're thinking about investment, we're asking the question, why do people invest their libidinal energy, their political energy, their ideological commitment in those kinds of ideas? And why do they seem unable to invest a similar kind of energy in far more progressive and productive ideas? Why does that seem impossible, and so on? And that goes back to my earlier point about the way by which, this notion of taxation. But, if you think about what taxes mean, taxes really have to do with the distribution of wealth. And the government says, we're going to distribute our money in order to make the lives of these people better. But what the right have done is to turn that into some kind of, unfair handout for these people. Why do they get something? Why don't you get something, et cetera, et cetera? And so, again, we need these interventions into these ways by which, the social system is valued and described. And that's the most powerful thing we can do right now. So conceptually, then, the idea of investment has to do with the flow of desire towards particular kinds of ideas and ideological positions, which we could also describe as territories.
Right.
I think time's up, so we need to actually to cut. No, now.
Yeah, almost 1.5 hours. I know.
Well,
Any more question? Manoji, do you have?
Excuse me?
Do you have a more question?
No, I think I was telling that it's already 1.5 hours for Ian.
Yeah. So I'm very excited. So I didn't know the actual time flies like this.
Yeah.
too
We were in
fast.
a conversational mode. It was really good. Like,
Yeah, it's like a flow over Ian.
out in many ideas.
Thank you for joining us, Ian.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we're gonna do another event,
Thanks
sooner.
for the wonderful book and the wonderful conversation that we had.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
very clarification there,
And we look forward to the second volume.
Yeah, very wonderful talk.
Yeah,
yeah, that we expect.
Just need to write it.
More critique. All right. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, guys. Thank you,
See
everyone,
you.
for listening.
Thank you,
Stay
mate.
safe. Stay safe.
live on YouTube.
Yeah.